Summer of 1943. The western perimeter of Guadalcanal smelled like rot and diesel, where Company F of the 132nd Infantry Regiment held a line of trenches and improvised shelters in terrain that was half mud, half mosquito. Technical Corporal Charles "Chuck" Rayner, a Browning M1919A4 machine gunner, had become the functional center of a section covering a vulnerable flank where streams and thick brush offered passage to small Japanese forces. At 27, with prior experience as a farm mechanic in Iowa, Rayner understood the weapon's internals as thoroughly as he understood the geometry of his field of fire. The nickname the Japanese had started using, the SAW, arrived through radio intercepts and rumors. The Browning's bursts, with steady cadence and rhythmic metallic sound, seemed to cut through the jungle. The effectiveness that earned him notoriety also carried moral weight, because every sustained burst cost barrel life, accumulated heat, and scarce ammunition brought in by mules or canoes. This is the story of how one man's understanding of steel and physics kept a position from collapsing when everything else already had. Rayner hadn't come to the Pacific looking for a reputation. He'd grown up in central Iowa, where his father ran a tractor repair shop on the edge of town, and his mother kept books for the grain elevator. By 15, Chuck could disassemble a carburetor blindfolded. By 18, he was diagnosing engine problems by sound alone, the way a doctor reads a heartbeat. He enlisted in January 1942, 3 weeks after Pearl Harbor, because the draft was coming anyway and the Army offered technical training. They sent him to Fort Benning for infantry school, then to an armorer's course at Aberdeen Proving Ground. He learned the M1919A4 the way he'd learned everything else, by taking it apart until he could see how each piece talked to the next. The Browning was a beautiful machine if you understood it. Air-cooled, belt-fed, capable of 400 rounds per minute when it ran clean. But in the jungle, nothing ran clean. Humidity swelled the cloth ammunition belts. Rust formed on feed mechanisms overnight. The barrel, designed to dissipate heat through airflow, struggled in the suffocating damp of Guadalcanal. Rayner had seen 3 guns jam during contact, because operators didn't respect the rhythm, didn't understand that metal had limits. His section landed on Guadalcanal in May 1943, part of the mop-up operations after the main Japanese withdrawal. But mop-up was a staff officer's word. The enemy still held pockets of resistance, still ran infiltration patrols, still contested every stream crossing and trail junction. Company F drew a sector on the western perimeter where a clay embankment provided decent elevation and overlapping fields of fire. They dug in. 3 gun positions, 50 yards apart, with rifle squads filling the gaps. Within a week, the Japanese started probing. Small groups, 10 or 15 men, testing for weakness. They came at dawn when the fog was thickest, or at dusk when the shadows turned the jungle into a maze. Rayner's guns stopped 2 probes in the first week. The sound carried, that distinctive hammering that echoed off the trees. Prisoners later mentioned it during interrogation, how the Americans had a gun that never stocked, that cut through vegetation like a saw through timber. The intelligence officer showed Rayner the transcript. He didn't feel proud. He felt responsible. The position sat on a clay ridge overlooking a network of streams that fed into the Lunga River. Dense vegetation, mostly mahogany and ironwood, hemmed in the approaches. Visibility varied from 30 yards in the thick stuff to maybe 200 where the undergrowth thinned. It was good defensive terrain, but logistics were a nightmare. The nearest supply dump was 8 miles back, connected by a trail that turned to soup when it rained, which was often. Company F had started with 6 spare barrels for the 3 M1919s. Standard doctrine, called for changing barrels every 200 rounds of sustained fire, or whenever the metals started to glow. In practice, Rayner's crew pushed it to 250, sometimes 300, because spared barrels were scarce and getting scarcer. Every engagement consumed metal and time. After the first week, they were down to 4 spares. After 10 days, 3. The resupply convoy that was supposed to arrive on June 12th got diverted to support operations on New Georgia. The next convoy, scheduled for June 18th, never showed up at all. Ammunition presented a different problem. The M1919 fired .3006 Springfield rounds, fed from cloth belts that held 50 cartridges each. In theory, Company F had adequate stocks, 12,000 rounds divided among 3 guns. In practice, 2 engagements burned through 4,000 rounds. A third engagement, a sustained firefight that lasted 90 minutes, consumed another 3,500. Suddenly, they were down to 4,500 rounds, with no resupply date confirmed. Sergeant Frank Leary, the section leader, a Boston cop in civilian life with a face like weathered granite, called a meeting under the camouflage netting. He spread a hand-drawn map on an ammunition crate. New orders from battalion. Conserve ammo. 5-round bursts only. Fire only if they're moving, not if you just think they're out there. The restriction made tactical sense, but it changed everything. The Browning's value came from sustained fire, from creating a wall of lead that forced enemy forces to ground or into cover. 5-round bursts turned it into an expensive rifle. Rayner understood the logic, but hated the constraint. He'd spent months learning to read terrain, to anticipate movement, to time his fire for maximum effect. Now, he had to ration violence. The real crisis arrived on June 20th. A C-47 carrying resupply for 3 companies diverted due to a tropical storm forming northeast of the island. Naval resupply got suspended because of submarine activity in Iron Bottom Sound. Suddenly, Company F was looking at 2 crates of ammunition, rusted replacement parts, and 3 days of food. Leary gathered the gun crews. "We're stretched. Division knows it. But we hold until they can get us supplied or pull us back." That night, Rayner sat on an overturned fuel can, cleaning his weapon by the light of a shielded flashlight. The rain drummed on the canvas shelter half above his head. Private Billy Davis, his assistant gunner, a 19-year-old from Tennessee who'd been a moonshiner before the war, squatted nearby. "We gonna make it, Corporal?" Rayner didn't answer immediately. He was studying the barrel assembly, noticing how the rifling had started to wear, how the air cooling vents were partially clogged with carbon residue. "We'll make it," he said finally. "But we need to change how we think about this gun." The idea came to Rayner during the night. While the rain turned the jungle into a percussion instrument and sleep remained impossible, the M1919's weakness in tropical conditions was heat management. The air cooling system worked fine in temperate climates, but in Guadalcanal's humidity, the barrel retained heat like a forge. What if they could force airflow through the cooling vents? By dawn, he'd sketched a rough diagram on the back of a ration card. He showed it to Davis and to Corporal Mike Thornton, the 3rd member of his crew, a Detroit factory worker who understood machinery. "We've got 2 damaged guns," Rayner explained. "One has a cracked receiver. The other's got a worn feed mechanism. Neither one's combat ready, but they've got parts we can use." Thornton studied the sketch. "You want to build a Frankenstein gun? I want to build a gun that doesn't overheat after 200 rounds. And the ventilation?" Rayner pointed to the wreckage of a Japanese truck that had been destroyed 2 weeks earlier, now rusting in a stream bed 50 yards from their position. "Fuel line tubing, flexible, heat-resistant. We rig it to force air through the barrel cooling vents." Davis frowned. "Force it how? We don't have a compressor." "Raft pump. Manual. One man operates the gun, one man pumps air." The plan violated every regulation in the technical manual. Field modifications required approval from ordnance officers. Using captured enemy materials required documentation and testing. Operating outside doctrine invited courts-martial, but regulations assumed functional supply lines, spare parts, and time. They had none of those things. Rayner took the idea to Sergeant Leary. The older man listened without interrupting, his jaw working a piece of gum that had long ago lost its flavor. When Rayner finished, Leary was quiet for a long moment. "You're sure about this?" "I'm sure we're out of options." Leary looked at the 2 disabled machine guns, then at the ammunition inventory scratched on a board. 2,400 rounds, divided into 48 belts of 50. He made the calculation every infantry sergeant learns to make, weighing risk against necessity. Do it. But if that jury-rigged piece blows up in your face, I'm putting you in for a Section 8 discharge on grounds of insanity. They worked through the night. First, they stripped down both damaged weapons, laying out parts on a canvas tarp. Barrels, bolts, triggers, feed mechanisms, recoil springs. Rayner selected the best components from each gun. The barrel from the weapon with the cracked receiver still had decent rifling. The feed mechanism from the other gun, though worn, operated smoothly. They assembled a hybrid weapon, testing each component before moving to the next. The ventilation system proved more challenging. They retrieved the fuel line from the Japanese truck, 20 feet of rubberized tubing designed to withstand gasoline and heat. Thornton cut it into sections, then used wire from a field telephone to lash the tubing to the barrel cooling vents. The raft pump, a hand-operated bellows designed for inflating rubber boats, connected to the main tube through a valve salvaged from a gas mask. When Davis worked the pump, air flowed through the tubes and across the barrel. It wasn't elegant. It probably wouldn't appear in any technical manual, but physics didn't care about elegance. By 0400, they had a weapon. Rayner loaded a belt, set the gun on its tripod, and fired a 10-round burst into the jungle. The mechanism cycled smoothly. He fired 20 rounds, 30, 50. Davis pumped steadily, forcing air through the cooling system. After 100 rounds, Rayner touched the barrel. Hot, but not critical. After 200 rounds, the steel was warm but stable. The system worked. "Well," Thornton said quietly, "we're either geniuses or we're gonna die when this thing explodes." Rayner didn't smile. "Get some sleep. We're gonna need it." The intelligence warning arrived at 0300 on June 22nd. An Army Air Force's reconnaissance flight had spotted movement along the eastern coast. Approximately 180 Japanese infantry, with mortar support, moving toward the American lines. The estimated time of contact, dawn. Rayner studied the terrain by flashlight, using the map Leary had sketched. The most likely approach followed the streambed, which provided cover and a clear route to the American position. Secondary approaches used the ridgelines on either flank. With 15 defenders and 3 machine guns, 2 of which were barely functional, they had to maximize overlapping fields of fire. He drew arcs on the map, calculating angles. Each M1919 had an effective range of about 1,500 yards, but in jungle terrain, visibility dropped that to maybe 300 yards maximum. He positioned the guns to cover 60-degree arcs with 15-degree overlaps, creating a kill zone where any advance would encounter multiple guns. The stakes he pounded into the ground limited the traverse of each weapon, preventing operators from firing into adjacent sectors. Ammunition got divided precisely, 200 belts of 50 rounds, split among the 3 positions. Raynor kept his modified gun as the primary weapon, with the two partially functional guns as backup. If the improvised cooling system failed, they'd default to standard operating procedure: short bursts, frequent barrel changes, pray the spares lasted. The waiting was worse than the preparation. Raynor sat behind his gun, watching fog settle into the streambed like something alive. The jungle sounds had gone quiet, which meant something was moving out there. Davis crouched beside him, one hand on the raft pump. Thornton lay prone 10 feet to the left, M1 carbine ready. Down the line, the other gun positions were invisible in the pre-dawn darkness, but Raynor knew they were there, knew the men were awake and afraid and ready. At 0430, Sergeant Leary moved along the line, low and quiet. He stopped at Raynor's position. "Radio says they're close, maybe 30 minutes. We're set." Leary looked at the hybrid weapon, at the tubes running from pump to barrel, at the makeshift brilliance of desperation. "Chuck, if this works, I'm putting you in for a commendation. If it doesn't, I'm putting you in for that Section 8. "Fair deal, Sarge." Leary moved on. The fog thickened. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called, then stopped. The silence afterward felt heavy, like the jungle was holding its breath. Raynor checked his watch, 0445. The first shapes emerged from the streambed like ghosts materializing from smoke. The Japanese came in disciplined silence, approximately 40 men in the first wave, moving in a loose skirmish line through the fog-shrouded streambed. They were maybe 150 yards out when Raynor spotted them, dark silhouettes against the gray dawn. He tracked their movement through the M1919 sights, waiting for them to enter the kill zone. At 120 yards, he opened fire. The Browning hammered out a 3-second burst, 15 rounds that tore through vegetation and bodies with equal efficiency. The sound shattered the morning quiet, echoing off the trees. Immediately, the other two guns joined in, creating an overlapping pattern of fire that swept the streambed. Men dropped, others dove for cover. The Japanese formation, so carefully organized, dissolved into chaos. Raynor fired again, another burst, tracking movement. Beside him, Davis worked the pump with steady rhythm, forcing air through the cooling tubes. Raynor could hear the hiss of airflow mixing with the mechanical clatter of the gun. He fired a third burst, a fourth. After 50 rounds, he touched the barrel briefly. Hot, yes, but manageable. The improvised system was working. The Japanese first wave broke after 15 minutes, retreating back down the streambed. Bodies lay scattered in the mud and shallow water. Raynor counted maybe 20, but visibility made accuracy difficult. He checked his ammunition. 3 belts expended, 150 rounds. They'd repelled the first probe with minimal expenditure. Sergeant Leary appeared through the smoke, moving in a low crouch. "Damage report? None. Guns functioning. System works. Keep it working. They'll be back." Leary was right. At 0530, the second wave hit, this time with mortar support. The first rounds landed 50 yards short, exploding in the trees. Shrapnel whistled overhead. The next salvo walked closer, finding range. One mortar round detonated 20 yards from the second gun position, and the concussion lifted the weapon off its tripod. The crew scrambled to recover it, but the mount was bent, the gun compromised. Now they were down to 2 weapons. The Japanese infantry advanced under the mortar barrage, using the explosions as cover. Raynor waited until they reached 80 yards, then opened fire. The modified M1919 cycled flawlessly, spitting out rounds in controlled bursts. He worked the target zone methodically, traversing left to right, forcing the enemy to ground. Davis pumped steadily, his face streaked with sweat despite the morning cool. After 200 rounds, the barrel remained below critical temperature. After 300 rounds, it stayed stable. The system was exceeding every expectation. But the ammunition was draining faster than Rayner wanted. He'd burned through 8 belts, 400 rounds. The resupply he'd counted on wasn't coming. Every round he fired now was one he wouldn't have later. At 0600, the sun broke through the canopy and the temperature climbed. Humidity thickened. The fog dissipated, replaced by rising steam from the jungle floor. Visibility improved, but so did the heat. Rayner could feel sweat running down his back, soaking his uniform. Davis was breathing hard from working the pump, his hands blistered. The radio crackled. Sergeant Leary's voice strained. "All positions, be advised. SCR-284 damaged. Reception only. No outgoing. You're on your own." Rayner keyed the handset twice in acknowledgement, then set it aside. No communication meant no artillery support, no air support, no reinforcements. They had what they had, nothing more. At 0630, movement on the left flank. Japanese infantry, maybe 15 men, trying to work around through the dense brush. A flanking maneuver. If they succeeded, the entire position would collapse. Rayner made a split-second decision. "Thornton, Davis, help me move this thing." They broke down the gun in seconds, disconnected the pump, grabbed the tripod. Moving under fire violated every tactical principle, but staying put meant getting flanked. They scrambled 20 yards left, found a depression in the ground, reset the weapon. The whole operation took 4 minutes. When the Japanese flanking group emerged from the brush, Rayner was waiting. He fired a sustained burst, 30 rounds that caught them in the open. The survivors scattered back into the jungle. But the barrel was glowing now, a dull red, visible even in daylight. The steel had reached its limit. Rayner checked his watch, 0710. They'd been in continuous contact for over 2 hours. The metal couldn't take much more. He signaled Davis to increase airflow. The pump wheezed, forcing cooler air across the superheated barrel. The temperature stabilized, but Rayner could see the slight warp developing in the steel, the way the barrel was beginning to droop almost imperceptibly. He had maybe 30 minutes before catastrophic failure, maybe less. At 0745, ammunition reached crisis level. Rayner had 200 rounds remaining, 4 belts. The third gun position was down to maybe 150 rounds. Sergeant Leary, his left leg wrapped in a blood-soaked bandage from a shrapnel wound, crawled to Rayner's position. His face was gray with pain. They're regrouping. Intelligence said reinforcements are an hour out, but that was at 0600. Could be 30 minutes now. Could be 2 hours. Rayner looked at his ammunition supply, did the math. 30 minutes of defensive fire with 200 rounds meant extremely selective targeting. 5-round bursts, no suppressive fire. Every shot had to count. The Japanese attack, when it came, was coordinated and desperate. 3 groups, advancing simultaneously from different angles, trying to overwhelm the position through sheer pressure. Rayner tracked the center group, let them close to 60 yards, then fired a precise burst that stopped their momentum. He shifted to the left group, fired again. The gun was cooking now. A barrel warped enough that he could see the rounds deviating slightly from true. Davis pumped frantically, but the cooling system had reached its limit. The rubber tubing was softening from heat exposure, starting to degrade. One connection pulled loose, and precious airflow dropped. Thornton scrambled to reconnect it, burning his hands on the hot metal fittings. At 0800, Rayner fired the last belt, 50 rounds. He made each one deliberate, spacing his shots, refusing to panic. When the weapon ran dry, he reached for his M1 carbine. It felt like a toy after hours behind the Browning. but it was all he had. And then, faint but growing louder, the sound of engines from deeper in the jungle. American engines. The relief force, a platoon from another company, arrived with fresh ammunition and reinforcements. The Japanese, hearing the new arrivals, broke contact and withdrew. The firing stopped. The jungle went silent, except for the ringing in Rayner's ears. He sat back from the gun, hands shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. Davis collapsed against the nearest tree, chest heaving. Thornton just stared at the modified weapon, at the warped barrel and melted tubing, at the improvised brilliance that had held the line. Sergeant Leary limped over, leaned on his rifle. "You count the bodies?" "No, Sarge." "Neither did I. Don't plan to. But we held." Rayner nodded. They'd held. Barely. The after-action assessment came 2 days later, after medics had evacuated the wounded and engineers had surveyed the position. The official tally: 37 enemy killed in action, 16 wounded and abandoned on the field. American casualties: 4 wounded, none killed. The Browning M1919A4 had fired approximately 1,200 rounds in continuous operation without a single malfunction. Exceptional performance in tropical conditions. A Navy technical team arrived from the logistics depot at Tulagi, led by Lieutenant Commander Harris, a former industrial engineer from Pittsburgh. He examined Rayner's modified weapon, like an archaeologist studying an artifact. He measured the tubing, sketched the pump connection, tested the airflow pattern. After an hour, he looked up. "Corporal, this shouldn't work. The cooling rate isn't sufficient. The pump volume is inadequate, and you're using enemy materials of unknown metallurgical composition." "But it did work," Rayner said quietly. "Yes, it did." Harris made notes in a leather-bound journal. "I'm recommending this for immediate field testing. We've been trying to solve barrel overheating for months. You solved it with a fuel line and a raft pump." The official report, filed a week later, described the system as an auxiliary emergency ventilation apparatus and recommended studies for industrial adaptation. 3 months later, the modification became standard procedure, formalized in Technical Manual 9-10005-21310, with instructions simplified for field improvisation. The method got a designation, Rayner Ventilation Protocol. But there was a cost that didn't appear in the technical reports. Medical officers documented extreme physical stress among the gun crew, severe dehydration, minor hand burns, auditory damage, exhaustion bordering on collapse. Rayner, in a personal statement included in his file, wrote, "Mechanical efficiency doesn't compensate for the human cost of sustained fire under heat and constant noise. We held the position, but we paid for it in ways that don't show up in the kill count." That observation reached brigade headquarters, where it caught the attention of a young staff officer who'd been studying crew fatigue patterns. The result was a new doctrine: mandatory rotation of machine gun crews during extended engagements, with shifts limited to 30-minute intervals. The change, implemented in August 1943, reduced physical collapse incidents by 40% across the division. The gun itself, too damaged for further combat use, got transferred to a training facility in the Philippines. There, it became a demonstration piece for machine gun schools, used to teach thermal management and ammunition conservation. Hundreds of soldiers learned their craft on Rayner's improvised weapon, though few knew its origin story. After the war, Charles Rayner returned to Iowa with 70% of his hearing intact and memories he rarely discussed. He married a girl named Sarah from the next county over, took over his father's repair shop, and settled into the quiet rhythm of civilian life. The Army sent him a letter of commendation from the Chief of Ordnance, and a technical bulletin citing his contribution to field doctrine. He kept both in a drawer, unframed. In 1948, his cooling modification inspired an electric ventilation system for stationary M1919 installations. The new system, powered by portable generators, reduced barrel temperature by 30% and extended combat effectiveness. The design specifications credited Field Innovations from Pacific Operations, but Rayner's name didn't appear in the patent documentation. He didn't mind. Recognition hadn't been the point. What did matter, what stayed with him through the decades, was the memory of that morning on Guadalcanal, when everything came down to physics and desperation. He'd learned something that few people understand. Every machine has hidden potential. Every limitation has a workaround. And sometimes, survival depends on seeing what's possible instead of what's permitted. He taught that principle to his son, who became an engineer. He taught it to apprentices in his shop, farm kids who wanted to learn how things worked. And when veterans gathered at the Legion Hall on warm summer evenings, when the talk turned to the Pacific and someone mentioned machine guns, Rayner would sometimes add a quiet observation. The weapon worked because we made it work. Not because it was designed to, but because we understood what it needed. On Guadalcanal, in the years immediately after the war, Japanese survivors occasionally spoke about that western perimeter position. They called it the throat of the saw, an expression that Allied intelligence recorded as evidence of psychological impact. The nickname, the saw, persisted among American veterans, but with an edge of bitterness, a recognition that while the gun had secured the position, it had also extracted a price measured in hearing loss and nightmares. The real legacy wasn't the body count or even the technical innovation. It was the doctrine that emerged from necessity, adaptive maintenance under scarcity, crew rotation, thermal management in humid climates, and the incorporation of mechanical ingenuity into infantry training. Those principles, refined and formalized, taught subsequent generations how to maintain sustained fire with economy and improvisation. Rayner remained uncomfortable with medals and uncomfortable with the word hero. He saw the weapon not as an extension of glory, but as an extension of necessity. In his later years, when historians occasionally contacted him about Pacific operations, he'd tell them the same thing. I was a mechanic who happened to understand that machine. When it mattered, the understanding was enough. He died in 1989, 2 weeks before his 73rd birthday. The obituary in the local paper mentioned his service, but focused more on his 40 years running the repair shop, on the generations of tractors and combines he'd kept running. A handful of veterans attended the funeral, men who remembered the sound of a Browning hammering through jungle fog. The improvised cooling system, now a footnote in technical manuals and a case study in engineering schools, outlived its creator. The principle he'd demonstrated, that any component can be reimagined to resist failure, even when everything around it seems to be melting, crossed borders and decades. It influenced weapons development, informed maintenance doctrine, and reminded engineers that sometimes the best solutions come from people who understand both the machine and its limits. The saw had stopped long ago, but what it represented, the idea that desperation and understanding can combine to create survival, that remained.